Welcome to Caveman Sleep Stories. If you're here tonight, you're likely searching for rest, hoping to quiet the thoughts that won't settle and find your way gently toward sleep. We exist in a world of calendars and weather apps, of 5-day forecasts available instantly, of meteorologists who tell us exactly when the first snow will arrive. We have heated homes that protect us from cold, grocery stores stocked year-round, winter warnings sent directly to our phones. But there's something we've forgotten in all this technological abundance, something our ancestors knew through necessity rather than choice. Tonight, we're exploring a question that might seem mysterious at first. How did people know when winter was coming without calendars, forecasts, or any written records? Not just guess vaguely or hope for the best, but predict accurately enough to prepare adequately, to gather sufficient food, to complete shelters before the first serious cold arrived. How could anyone know that winter was 6 weeks away just by watching the world? What signs announced the approaching cold so reliably that people could base their survival on them? What did ancient people observe in nature that allowed them to prepare for winter months in advance, to never be caught by surprise when snow finally fell? We'll discover the sophisticated observation systems that actually worked, the bird migrations that served as calendars, the plant changes that marked time's passage, the celestial movements that never failed, the animal behaviors that announced seasons, and the convergence of multiple signs that created certainty where we might expect only guesswork. We'll learn about geese departing, and sun positions shifting, and mammoths growing thick coats, about frost patterns and star movements, and the reliability of nature's many clocks. If you drift off while listening, that's exactly what should happen. Consider subscribing if these stories help you find rest. And there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description if you'd like to support this channel. A like helps others discover these sleep stories too. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's travel back to a time when people lived without weather forecasts or calendars, when survival depended on reading nature's signs with precision, when the natural world announced winter's approach through dozens of signals that anyone could learn to interpret, yet somehow, through careful observation across generations, people knew exactly when to prepare, exactly how much time remained, and were ready when the cold finally arrived. The geese gather in larger flocks each morning as late summer transitions into early autumn, their calls filling the dawn air with a particular urgency that wasn't present in the quiet contentment of summer feeding. And this gathering isn't random or sudden, but follows a pattern that repeats year after year with remarkable consistency, creating a natural rhythm that becomes as familiar as the changing position of the sun or the cooling of evening air, a signal that experienced observers recognize immediately as meaning winter is perhaps 6 to 8 weeks away, enough time to finish preparations, but not enough time to waste or delay. The birds responding to subtle changes in day length and temperature that humans also feel but might not consciously register without paying careful attention to these feathered calendars that never fail to announce the approaching cold. Different species leave at different times, creating a cascade of departures that functions like a countdown, measured not in days marked on calendars, but in the progressive emptying of the skies, in the silence that gradually replaces the constant calling and movement that characterized warmer months. The smaller songbirds first, then the waterfowl, finally the larger migrating birds, each departure marking another stage in autumn's progression, each absence providing another data point that confirms what other signs are also indicating, that winter is indeed approaching, and the window for preparation is steadily closing with the same inexorable certainty that the sun moves across the sky or that night follows day. The smaller birds begin their restlessness first, the ones that feed on flying insects through the summer months, catching their prey on the wing in aerial displays that filled warm weather skies with constant darting motion, and their agitation becomes visible in how they move through the landscape, no longer scattered across wide territories in solitary hunting or in small family groups, but gathering into tight formations that wheel through the air in coordinated movements, practicing the long flight that lies ahead of them, strengthening wing muscles that must carry them hundreds or thousands of miles to distant wintering grounds where insects continue flying through the cold months that would kill them here in northern latitudes. These birds, the swallows and swifts that catch insects on the wing, the warblers and flycatchers that glean insects from leaves and branches, the nighthawks that hunt insects during twilight hours, begin their departure preparations when the days are still warm, when most people wouldn't yet think seriously about winter preparations, when frost seems like a distant possibility rather than an imminent reality. But their leaving comes exactly 8 to 10 weeks before the first hard freeze will lock the landscape into winter's grip, a timing so consistent across years and decades that it functions as a reliable early warning system, a signal that those who know how to read it can use to gauge how much time remains before cold weather arrives in force and makes certain kinds of preparation work difficult or impossible. Watch them gather on particular trees or rock formations, their numbers swelling each evening as more individuals and family groups join the congregation, arriving from feeding territories that might span many miles around the gathering point, their chatter and movement reaching a crescendo over several days as the flock size builds toward the critical mass that will trigger departure. And then one morning the trees stand empty, the rocks silent, the birds gone south in a single night of coordinated flight. And that absence announces clearly that autumn has truly begun, that the countdown toward winter has started in earnest, that the comfortable abundance of summer has entered its final phase, and the time for serious preparation has arrived, whether anyone feels ready or not. The departure happens suddenly after days or weeks of gathering, as if some signal invisible and inaudible to human senses passes through the flock and triggers unanimous agreement that the time has come, that conditions are right, that delay risks disaster, while immediate departure offers the best chance for successful completion of the long journey ahead. One evening, the trees hold thousands of birds, their collective sound audible from great distances, their massed presence creating a spectacle that draws attention from anyone within view. And the next morning, those same trees stand in silence, hosting perhaps a few stragglers or confused individuals, but empty of the vast congregation that filled them the day before, the sudden absence almost shocking in its completeness, in the way it transforms the landscape's character from populated to empty, from active to quiet, from summer to autumn in a single night. A week or two after the insect eaters depart, the waterfowl begin showing similar patterns of gathering and restlessness, the ducks and geese that spent summer months scattered across countless small ponds and lakes and rivers and wetlands, now coming together in larger groups at traditional gathering sites, places that have served as staging areas for as long as anyone can remember, locations chosen perhaps for their abundant food resources, or their safety from predators, or their favorable position relative to migration routes, their flocks growing daily as birds from distant territories join the congregation, responding to the same internal calendar that tells them summer has ended and migration time approaches. The morning air fills with their calls, a constant conversation of honks and quacks and gabbling that increases in volume and urgency as departure time approaches, the birds communicating continuously about conditions and timing and the approach of their departure date, sharing information in ways that human observers can hear but not fully understand, can recognize as meaningful but can't translate into specific messages or detailed content. These birds respond not just to day-length changes but also to temperature patterns and wind conditions, their migration timing influenced by multiple environmental factors that all must align properly before departure can succeed. and their waiting period while these conditions develop provides an opportunity for observation, a chance to watch the flock size swell day by day, to hear the growing excitement and urgency in their vocalizations, to understand that when they finally depart, and they will depart suddenly, usually overnight when conditions align properly with their internal readiness and the environmental factors that support successful migration. Winter is now perhaps 5 to 6 weeks away, close enough that all preparation should be well underway, that major projects should be nearing completion, far enough away that adequate time still exists to finish necessary work if efforts continue steadily without distraction or delay. The larger migratory birds, the cranes and the swans and certain species of geese that travel in spectacular formations visible for miles, that call down from the sky with sounds that carry across vast distances, depart last among the migrants, their movement coming when autumn is well established, when morning frost already appears regularly on vegetation and exposed surfaces, when the first light snows might have already dusted higher elevations, even while lower areas remain free of snow cover, when the seasonal transition has progressed far enough that winter's approach seems obvious rather than subtle, immediate rather than distant. These birds provide the final warning among the migrants, their departure announcing that winter is now mere weeks away, perhaps 3 or 4 at most, that the time for preparation has almost passed into the time when preparations must be complete, that what isn't ready now might not be ready at all, when the full force of winter arrives with its snow and ice and bitter cold that makes outdoor work exhausting and sometimes dangerous. Their flight overhead, moving in their distinctive V formations that reduce wind resistance and allow the flock to travel farther on less energy, their calls that echo down from the sky can be heard from great distances, their passage visible for long stretches as they cross the landscape, creates a moment that everyone pauses to witness, a confirmation that the seasonal transition has reached its final stage before winter proper, that the cold months are nearly upon the land and will arrive soon regardless of how ready anyone might or might not be to receive them. But the birds don't just announce winter through their departures. Their behavior changes weeks before they actually leave, providing even earlier signals for those who know what to watch for and how to interpret what they observe in bird behavior and movement patterns. Feeding patterns shift from leisurely grazing and hunting to urgent consumption, birds spending more hours each day eating, taking fewer breaks between feeding sessions, building the fat reserves they'll need for migration flights that might cover hundreds of miles without opportunity to stop and rest and feed, and also building the reserves they'll need for surviving in their winter territories where food might be less abundant than in summer breeding grounds, or where competition from resident birds might make feeding more difficult for newly arrived migrants. Vocalizations change in character and frequency, becoming more varied and more constant, as if the birds are communicating continuously about conditions and timing and the coordination required for successful group migration, their calls taking on qualities that weren't present during the quiet contentment of summer when each bird or pair occupied its own territory and had little need for constant communication with others of its species. Young birds from that year's hatching begin flying more extensively, strengthening wings that must soon carry them thousands of miles south on their first migration, a journey that will test their endurance and navigation abilities, their practice flights becoming longer and more confident each day as departure time approaches, the young birds gradually building the strength and skill that will determine whether they survive the migration or perish during the attempt. All of these behavioral changes ripple through the bird populations in predictable sequence, creating a tapestry of signals that accumulate and reinforce each other across the days and weeks of late summer and early autumn, that build a clear picture of seasonal progression for anyone paying attention and remembering how these patterns unfolded in previous years. that remove any doubt about what time of year it is and what must be done before the weather turns harsh and makes certain kinds of work impossible to complete safely or effectively. The restlessness appears first, visible in how birds move through their territories with less purpose and more agitation. Then the gathering begins at traditional staging areas. Then the feeding intensifies as birds build reserves. Then the vocalizations increase as departure coordination develops. Then finally the actual departure happens in a rush of wings and calls that leaves the landscape noticeably emptier, noticeably quieter, noticeably changed in ways that anyone can perceive even without detailed knowledge of bird behavior or migration patterns. This progression from normal summer behavior through increasingly obvious preparation activities to final departure creates a timeline that marks autumn's advance with precision that rivals or exceeds any human-made calendar, a natural measurement system that requires no tools or calculations, but simply observation and memory, recognition of patterns, and their repetition across years and decades. The reliability of birds as seasonal indicators comes from their sensitivity to environmental cues that humans experience but might not consciously process without deliberate attention and systematic observation across many seasons. Day-length changes trigger hormonal shifts in bird physiology that drive migratory urges, responses encoded so deeply in their biology through evolutionary processes operating across thousands of generations that the birds must follow these impulses or suffer consequences ranging from arrival at wintering grounds after food resources have been depleted by earlier arrivals to being caught by winter weather during migration when their bodies are adapted for flight rather than cold weather survival. And this biological imperative means their timing holds remarkably consistent year after year, varying by perhaps a week at most and usually less, typically just a few days of variation that might result from unusual weather conditions, but that rarely exceeds the narrow window that experience teaches observers to expect. The same species leaves at the same time each autumn, give or take those few days of variation, and this consistency means that watching birds provides not just general warning that winter approaches, but specific timing information about how many weeks remain before serious cold arrives, how much time exists for completing necessary preparations, when urgency must replace steady effort in the work of getting ready for the long, dark months ahead that will test every aspect of preparation and reveal whether food stores are adequate and shelters properly weatherproofed and fuel supplies sufficient for the cold that will persist for months without significant warming. Different species leaving at different times creates a cascading series of signals, each departure marking a particular point in the countdown toward winter, each absence providing specific information about how far autumn has progressed and how near winter actually stands. When the first insect eaters depart, 8 to 10 weeks of preparation time remain, a generous window that allows methodical work on major projects without rushing or cutting corners, time to do things properly rather than hastily. When the general waterfowl depart, 5 to 6 weeks remain, still adequate time, but requiring steady effort without significant delays, a period when work should progress daily toward completion of essential preparations. When the final large migrants depart, 3 to 4 weeks remain, a brief window that demands focus on critical tasks and abandonment of anything non-essential, a period when every day matters, and procrastination could mean being caught unprepared when winter arrives in force. This graduated warning system, with multiple checkpoints marking the countdown's progression, provides better information than any single departure point could offer, allowing people to gauge not just whether winter is coming, which is never in doubt, but precisely how near it stands and how urgently remaining preparations must proceed to be ready when cold weather finally arrives and outdoor work becomes difficult or impossible. The sun's journey across the southern sky changes throughout the year in ways that are completely predictable and measurable, even without instruments or sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics. And people track this movement not through abstract calculations or mathematical models, but through simple, direct observation of where the sun rises and sets relative to permanent landmarks scattered across the horizon. That distinctive notch between two peaks on the distant ridge, that lone, dead tree standing stark against the skyline, that particular rock formation that catches the eye with its unusual shape, that peculiar boulder balanced precariously on a hilltop, features of the landscape that never move, and therefore serve as reliable reference points for tracking solar motion across the seasons, creating a natural observatory where the horizon itself functions as a measurement tool, and the sun's position relative to fixed landmarks provides precise information about seasonal timing and the approach of winter's cold. In midsummer, the sun rises far to the northeast, climbing quickly into the sky and traveling high overhead at midday when it reaches its maximum elevation and casts the shortest shadows, then descending gradually through the afternoon and setting far to the northwest as darkness finally arrives late in the evening, creating long days where light fills most of the waking hours and makes outdoor work and travel easy and pleasant, where darkness comes late enough that evening activities can continue for hours after the main work of the day has been completed, where morning light arrives early enough that the day begins with ample time for accomplishing everything that needs doing before darkness forces a halt to activities that require good vision. But as summer progresses into autumn, the rising and setting points shift steadily southward along the horizon, moving in a pattern so consistent that it can be measured by the width of a hand held at arm's length against the horizon line. The sun's position changing by roughly 2 hand widths farther south each week as Earth continues its orbital journey around the sun, and the planet's tilted axis creates the seasonal cycle of changing solar illumination that drives all the patterns of weather and climate and biological activity that characterize different times of year. This change isn't subtle or difficult to detect, but rather obvious to anyone paying attention even casually. Anyone who happens to notice where the sun rises or sets on consecutive days or weeks. Anyone who stands in the same location at sunrise or sunset on different occasions and observes how the sun's position has shifted relative to those permanent horizon landmarks that provide fixed reference points for comparison. The movement becomes unmistakable after even brief observation. After just a few weeks of occasional attention to where the sun appears relative to landmarks that don't move, and therefore reveal clearly how the sun's position is changing day by day and week by week as the season advances toward winter. This southward drift means the sun's path across the sky becomes lower each passing week. The arc it traces from horizon to horizon growing shorter and never reaching the high overhead position that characterized midsummer, the angle at which sunlight strikes the earth becoming more oblique so that the same amount of solar energy spreads over a larger surface area and delivers less heating per unit of ground surface. And these geometric changes translate directly into shorter days and longer nights, into less heat absorbed by the ground during daylight hours when the sun shines, into cooler temperatures that become noticeable first in the early morning and evening when the sun hangs low near the horizon and provides minimal heating, then spreading gradually into the middle hours of the day, as well as the sun's maximum elevation continues to decline, and even midday warmth diminishes compared to summer's peak heating. By the time the sun rises and sets directly south of the summer positions, by the time the day length has shortened noticeably from summer's peak, losing perhaps 1 or 2 hours of daylight by this point in the seasonal progression, a change that affects daily routines and available working time significantly. Winter is perhaps 3 to 4 months away, distant still in that the actual cold weather and snow and ice haven't arrived yet, but close enough to begin preparations in earnest, to start thinking seriously about food stores and winter shelter improvements and fuel supplies and all the work that must be completed before the cold arrives in force and makes certain tasks difficult or impossible to accomplish effectively. The beauty of using solar position as a seasonal indicator lies in its absolute reliability and its long advance warning period that provides months rather than weeks of notice about winter's approach. The sun's movement never fails, never varies from year to year by any amount that human observation can detect without precise instruments, follows laws of orbital mechanics that operate with perfect mathematical consistency regardless of local weather conditions or unusual temperature patterns or any other variable factor that might confuse other seasonal signs or create false signals about seasonal timing. A warm autumn might delay some animal behaviors or plant changes, creating temporary confusion about whether winter is actually approaching or whether summer-like conditions might persist longer than usual. But the sun continues its southward progression on exactly the same schedule it has followed since Earth took its current orbital configuration billions of years ago. And this mathematical precision means that tracking solar position provides advance warning measured not in weeks, but in months, time to plan carefully rather than scrambling to prepare in haste, opportunity to complete preparations thoroughly and methodically, and to address problems or difficulties that arise during the work, time to test solutions and make adjustments and ensure that everything is properly ready rather than accepting marginal preparations because time ran out before work could be completed to a satisfactory standard. Measuring the sun's position requires no special tools or complicated procedures, no written records or mathematical calculations, just consistent observation from a familiar location where landmarks provide reference points that can be memorized and used for comparison across days and weeks and months. Stand in the same spot each morning or evening. Note where the sun appears relative to the horizon features that have been chosen as reference markers, and the pattern becomes clear within days. The sun has moved, continues moving, will keep moving southward along the horizon until it reaches its winter extreme at the shortest day of the year, after which it begins its slow return northward toward summer's height, retracing its path and marking the progression from winter through spring and into summer again. Use hands held at arm's length to measure the distance the sun has traveled from its summer position, counting the hand widths that span from where the sun used to rise or set during midsummer to where it now appears during autumn, and simple counting reveals how many hand widths of movement have occurred, how many more remain before the winter solstice arrives and marks the sun's southern extreme, how the rate of change relates to the passage of time and the approach of cold weather that will arrive on schedule as determined by Earth's orbital position and axial tilt. The changing day length becomes noticeable not just through solar position tracking, but through how daily activities fit into the available light. How routines that were easy to complete during long summer days must be compressed or rescheduled as autumn progresses and daylight hours diminish week by week. Tasks that could be done leisurely in long summer evenings. Gathering firewood and processing it into sizes suitable for burning, collecting food plants and preparing them for storage, working on tools and equipment and making repairs or improvements, social interactions around fires where stories are shared and skills taught, and community bonds maintained, must be completed earlier as autumn progresses, as darkness arrives sooner each evening and cuts short the working day, as morning light comes later each day and delays the start of activities that require good visibility. The body's rhythms respond to these changes naturally and automatically without conscious effort required. Waking naturally with dawn means waking later each morning as sunrise comes later. Going to sleep after sunset means sleeping earlier each night as sunset arrives sooner. And these internal adjustments provide visceral confirmation of what solar observation reveals intellectually, that the season is turning, that winter approaches with steady inevitability, that the time for preparation grows shorter with each passing day and must be used wisely while light and relatively mild weather still permit outdoor work to proceed at reasonable pace without the extreme difficulty that deep cold will bring. The woolly mammoths that graze in distant view across the tundra, their massive forms visible for miles across the open landscape where little obstruction blocks long sightlines, begin developing noticeably thicker coats in early autumn, a transformation that happens gradually over weeks and months, but becomes unmistakable once you know to watch for it and understand what the changes signify. The animal's shaggy covering growing denser and longer with each passing week, adding layer upon layer of insulation that will eventually provide perhaps 30% more thermal protection than they carried during summer months when overheating posed more risk than cold exposure. And this thickening isn't triggered by cold weather arriving, but rather by the changing length of days, by subtle shifts in light exposure that photoperiod sensitive cells in the animal's bodies detect and respond to, by initiating hormonal changes that drive coat development, signals that tell the mammoth's biology that winter is coming even while temperatures remain relatively mild and comfortable, even while nothing in the immediate weather suggests that serious cold lies ahead. The reindeer herds show similar changes, their coats darkening and thickening in response to the same photoperiod cues, their summer sleekness that made them vulnerable to overheating during warm weather, giving way to winter bulk that will keep them warm when temperatures plunge far below freezing and wind drives chill factors even lower. The transformation visible from considerable distance as their appearance shifts from the lighter, shorter summer pelage to the dense, darker winter fur that will insulate them through the coldest months ahead, when food energy must be conserved rather than wasted on maintaining body temperature against extreme cold that would otherwise drain their reserves and threaten survival. Horses in the region develop longer, shaggier covering, their manes and tails growing fuller, and their body hair extending to create better insulation against wind and cold. The transformation less dramatic, perhaps, than in mammoths or reindeer, but still clearly visible to observers who pay attention to how the animals look across the progression of seasons from summer through autumn into winter. Even smaller animals show these changes for those who look closely enough and know what to watch for. The hares and foxes and ground squirrels begin developing increased fur density during this period, their summer coats giving way to winter insulation weeks or even months before the truly cold weather arrives. The transformation driven by the same photoperiod cues that affect the larger herbivores and predators. The decreasing day length sending chemical signals through their bodies that trigger physiological responses encoded in their genetics through countless generations of evolution that refined the timing to maximize survival during the harsh conditions that characterize winter in these latitudes. Arctic foxes, in particular, undergo dramatic changes that make them almost unrecognizable compared to their summer appearance. Their brownish summer coats that help them blend into the tundra vegetation, replaced gradually by the thick white winter fur that provides both insulation against cold and camouflage against snow, making them nearly invisible when they lie still against white backgrounds. The transition beginning in early autumn when temperatures remain relatively mild, but day length has shortened noticeably from summer's peak and continues until the transformation is complete and the fox wears its full winter disguise. Wolverines and other fur-bearing predators show similar patterns, their pelts becoming denser and more luxurious as autumn progresses, the quality of their fur improving steadily as additional guard hairs grow in and underfur thickens to create insulation layers that trap air and prevent heat loss, changes that make these animals look larger and bulkier during winter months compared to their sleeker summer appearance when overheating prevention was more important than cold protection. For people watching these changes unfold across the landscape and across multiple species, the animals' preparations provide advance warning measured not in days but in months. Time to finish food gathering while plants still produce edible materials, and before frost kills tender vegetation or hardens the ground and makes root digging impossible. To improve shelters while weather still permits extensive work outdoors without the numbing cold that makes detailed work difficult and dangerous. To collect extra firewood while the ground remains unfrozen and trees can be cut and transported relatively easily without having to drag them across snow or ice. To complete all the preparations that mean the difference between surviving winter comfortably with adequate food and fuel and shelter versus struggling through it desperately with insufficient resources and marginal protection against the cold that will persist for months without significant respite. The animals respond to signals that humans might not consciously perceive without specialized instruments. Subtle changes in photoperiod that their eyes register with precision but that require sophisticated equipment to measure accurately. Incremental temperature shifts that their bodies feel through sensory systems evolved specifically for detecting such changes, but that seem too small to matter when measured by human sensation alone. But by watching the animals' responses, by reading the calendar written in fur and feathers and behavior, people gain access to the same predictive information that evolution has encoded into wildlife biology over countless generations of natural selection that rewarded accurate timing and punished preparation that came too early or too late. The animals whose ancestors prepared at the right time survived to pass their genes forward. Those whose timing was off perished and left no descendants. And this relentless selection refined the timing mechanisms until they achieved the precision that now makes animal behavior such a reliable indicator of seasonal progression and winter's approach. The timing of coat changes provides specific information about how far away winter actually stands, creating a graduated scale of preparation stages that mark the countdown toward cold weather with precision that allows people to gauge not just whether winter is coming, but exactly how near it stands. When mammoths first begin showing thicker fur, when the initial darkening and lengthening becomes visible on their flanks and shoulders, and the transformation can be seen clearly even from considerable distance. Winter typically lies 3 months distant, far enough away that preparation can proceed at a reasonable pace without panic or extreme urgency, but close enough that work should begin in earnest, and major projects should be initiated if they haven't started already, close enough that this is the time for planning and organization and initiating the work that will take weeks or months to complete. When the transformation reaches its midpoint, when the winter coat covers perhaps half the animal's body, and the summer fur remains only in patches that grow smaller each day as new growth continues. Winter is roughly 6 to 8 weeks away. Time to accelerate preparations and complete major tasks that can't be finished. Once snow and ice make outdoor work difficult, time to ensure that food stores are approaching adequacy and that shelter improvements are nearly complete and that fuel supplies have been gathered in quantities that will last through the long cold months ahead without requiring additional collection trips in dangerous weather. When the winter coat appears fully developed, when the summer fur has vanished entirely and the animals wear their full cold weather insulation that makes them look dramatically larger and bulkier than they appeared during summer months, winter stands perhaps 2 to 4 weeks distant, close enough that any remaining preparations must be completed quickly, and that the window for outdoor work is closing rapidly, close enough that the first serious storms could arrive at any time and mark the true beginning of winter proper, rather than just autumn's cold nights. This gradual transformation in animal appearance creates a visual timeline that requires no counting or record keeping, just observation and memory, remembering what the animals looked like weeks ago when their summer coats still dominated, noticing how they looked now with winter fur partially or fully developed, recognizing the progression that indicates seasonal change and provides specific timing information about how many weeks remain before winter arrives in force. Different animals reach different stages of their coat transformation at different times, creating multiple independent indicators that can be cross-referenced against each other to build confidence in seasonal timing assessment. If the mammoths show early coat changes but the reindeer don't, perhaps the mammoths are responding to some local condition rather than true seasonal progression. Or perhaps that particular mammoth herd has unusual genetics that create earlier timing compared to the regional norm. But when all the animals show similar changes on similar schedules, when their transformations align and confirm each other across multiple species and multiple herds, the signal becomes unmistakable and reliable, a message from the natural world that winter is indeed approaching and will arrive on its usual schedule regardless of anyone's wishes or state of preparation, regardless of whether people feel ready or would prefer more time to complete their work. The grasses across the tundra begin releasing their seeds in late summer, a transformation that starts gradually in a few early species but accelerates quickly once the main season begins. The seed heads that formed during summer growth now ripening and opening under the influence of changing day length and temperature patterns, their contents dispersing on the wind or dropping to the ground or catching in the fur of passing animals that serve as unwitting seed transporters carrying genetic material to new locations where germination might occur next spring. The plants completing their reproductive cycle before winter's cold shuts down all growth and activity and makes seed dispersal impossible due to snow cover and frozen conditions that would trap seeds in place rather than allowing them to spread across the landscape to colonize new areas. Different grass species release their seeds at different times, creating a sequence of dispersal events that unfolds over several weeks of late summer and early autumn, each species following its own genetically programmed schedule, but all of them completing the process before hard frost arrives and temperatures drop low enough to damage the seeds or prevent their successful distribution, before conditions deteriorate to the point where seed dispersal becomes impossible, and any seeds remaining on parent plants face likely death during the winter months ahead, when cold and snow and ice dominate the landscape. The earliest grasses begin seed release in late summer when weather remains warm and days still long, while the latest species wait until early autumn when the first cool nights have arrived and morning dew lies heavy on the ground and other seasonal signs have already accumulated to announce autumn's arrival. But all of them finish their dispersal before winter truly arrives, before snow covers the landscape and makes seed movement impossible, before ice locks everything in place and reproductive processes must cease until spring warmth returns and the cycle begins again. Trees follow similar patterns, their seed and nut production reaching maturity at specific times that correspond with seasonal progression toward winter, times that have been refined through evolution to maximize the seed's survival chances and the parent tree's reproductive success. Pines and other conifers drop their cones when the seeds within have ripened fully, The scales that protected developing seeds now opening to release winged seeds that spiral down through the air with a distinctive motion, spreading away from the parent tree on wind currents that might carry them considerable distances before they finally touch ground and settle wherever they land. Some falling on favorable soil where they'll germinate successfully next spring, and others landing on unsuitable locations where they'll perish without ever sprouting. But the trees produce so many seeds that even low success rates ensure adequate offspring survival to maintain populations and expand into new territories when opportunities arise. Deciduous trees, the birches and willows and aspens that grow in sheltered valleys and along waterways where conditions provide enough moisture and shelter to support these species that can't survive the exposed tundra's harsh conditions, release their seeds earlier than conifers. Their lightweight, wind-dispersed seeds floating through late summer air in clouds of fluff that catch the light and drift across the landscape like early snow, accumulating in corners and against obstacles where they form temporary piles that gradually disperse as wind continues to move them along until they finally settle in locations where next spring's germination might or might not occur depending on local soil and moisture conditions. Nut-bearing trees drop their acorns and hazelnuts and other hard-shelled seeds in early autumn, the nuts falling heavily to the ground where animals gather them for immediate food or cache them for winter consumption, burying them in scattered locations that serve as larders for the animals, but also as planting sites for the trees, since many cached nuts are never retrieved and germinate where they were buried. If conditions are favorable, the trees essentially using animals as planting agents that spread seeds far from parent trees and bury them at proper depth for successful germination, a symbiotic relationship that benefits both parties and has evolved over countless generations until it operates with remarkable efficiency. The trees producing these energy-rich seeds time their ripening precisely to coincide with the period when animals need to build fat reserves for the coming cold, ensuring that animals will be highly motivated to gather the nuts and creating strong incentive for the caching behavior that serves the tree's reproductive interests even while meeting the animal's nutritional needs during the critical preparation period before winter arrives. The completion of seed dispersal marks a clear transition point in the plant world's annual cycle, a moment when growth and reproduction end and dormancy begins, when plants shift from active metabolism that requires continuous energy expenditure to winter survival mode that minimizes energy use and tolerates freezing temperatures and snow burial that would kill plants still engaged in active growth. Grasses that release their seeds begin dying back, their green color fading to brown and gold as chlorophyll breaks down and is either reabsorbed into root systems for storage or simply abandoned in above-ground tissues that will die and decay, their leaves and stems drying as the plant withdraws resources from structures that won't survive winter anyway, and concentrates nutrients in root systems that will survive frozen soil and emerge again when spring warmth returns and initiates new growth for another year's cycle. Trees that drop their seeds begin preparing for leaf fall, the deciduous species especially showing color changes as chlorophyll breaks down and other pigments that were always present, but masked by chlorophyll's dominance become visible. The greens of summer giving way to yellows and reds and browns that signal the tree's withdrawal from active growth, its preparation for winter dormancy when frozen conditions will prevent water uptake and make photosynthesis impossible. These plant changes provide seasonal indicators that work on timescales similar to bird behavior and solar position, offering weeks or months of advance warning rather than days, providing time for methodical preparation rather than panicked rushing to complete critical tasks. When the first grasses begin releasing seeds, winter typically stands 2 to 3 months away, distant enough that winter seems almost abstract, an intellectual knowledge rather than an immediate threat, but approaching steadily and requiring that serious preparation begin even while warm weather continues and immediate conditions suggest no urgency. When seed dispersal reaches its peak, when most plant species have released their reproductive materials and begun their withdrawal from active growth, when seed heads stand empty and plants show the first signs of autumn color and dormancy preparation, winter lies perhaps 6 to 8 weeks ahead, close enough to demand serious attention to preparation tasks and steady progress on work that must be completed before cold arrives, far enough away that work can proceed methodically rather than frantically if efforts continue consistently without major interruptions or delays. When the last plants finish seed release, when even the latest reproducing species have completed their cycles and begun dormancy, when no more seeds can be found dispersing anywhere across the landscape, winter is perhaps 3 to 4 weeks distant, close enough that any remaining preparation must be completed quickly with focus on essential tasks only, far enough away still that adequate time exists if work proceeds efficiently, that the comfortable window for outdoor work hasn't quite closed, but is nearly shut and will slam completely within weeks. The reliability of plant-based seasonal indicators comes from the same source as animal-based signs. Plants respond to environmental cues that operate with consistent timing year after year, photoperiod changes, and temperature patterns that vary little from one autumn to the next, barring unusual climate anomalies. And these responses have been refined by evolution over countless generations to occur at the optimal time for seed survival and plant reproductive success. Times that maximize the probability that seeds will be dispersed successfully and will find themselves in favorable conditions for surviving winter and germinating when spring arrives. A plant that releases seeds too early risks having them germinate in autumn only to be killed by winter cold before they can establish strong root systems capable of surviving freezing, producing offspring that perish and contribute nothing to the next generation, wasting reproductive effort on failed reproduction. A plant that releases seeds too late risks having them caught on the dying parent plant, where they'll be destroyed by winter weather or buried under snow before they can disperse properly, again wasting reproductive effort and failing to contribute to population maintenance or expansion. The timing that exists now represents the evolutionary solution to these challenges, the schedule that maximizes reproductive success across the population, and that schedule repeats with remarkable consistency across the years, because the underlying environmental cues, photoperiod especially, which varies hardly at all from year to year, operate like clockwork and drive plant responses with equal consistency, making plant behavior a reliable calendar for those who know what to watch for and how to interpret what they observe in plant development and seed dispersal timing. The first frost appears on a morning when multiple conditions align properly to create freezing temperatures at ground level, clear skies that allow heat to radiate away from the ground overnight without cloud cover trapping warmth near the surface, calm air that prevents warm and cold layers from mixing and allows cold air to pool in low areas where it reaches temperatures below freezing, enough moisture in the air to condense into visible ice crystals as temperatures drop below the dew point and water vapor transitions directly to solid ice. All of these factors coming together to create a morning when the world wears a temporary white coating that transforms the landscape's appearance, making everything sparkle in early sunlight, making grass and leaves and surfaces look painted with white that disappears as soon as sunlight strikes it with warming energy and melts the delicate ice crystals back into water vapor that evaporates into the atmosphere. This first frost typically arrives at a predictable time each autumn, varying by perhaps a week or two from year to year, depending on whether particular autumn is warmer or colder than average, but generally occurring within a consistent window that people learn to expect through years of observation, to watch for as a significant marker in the seasonal progression toward winter, to recognize as confirming what other signs have already been suggesting about seasonal timing and the approach of cold weather that will eventually dominate for months. The timing of this first frost provides clear information about how much time remains before serious cold arrives, before winter establishes itself permanently rather than visiting briefly during especially cold nights that alternate with warmer days when temperatures rise well above freezing and conditions feel more like extended autumn than like true winter. The first frost comes when night temperatures drop just barely below freezing, when the coldest hours before dawn reach perhaps -1 or 2 degrees Celsius. Cold enough to freeze water vapor into delicate ice crystals that form intricate patterns on surfaces, but not cold enough to freeze standing water in ponds and puddles, not cold enough to create thick ice or to damage plants that have adapted to expect such brief cold snaps during autumn's progression, not cold enough to require major adjustments in daily routines or to prevent outdoor work from proceeding normally. This frost appears first in low-lying areas where cold air settles during calm nights, in meadows and valleys where terrain funnels descending cold air into pools that grow progressively colder as night progresses, and heat continues radiating away from the surface without being replenished by solar input that won't return until sunrise hours away. While hilltops and slopes might remain above freezing throughout the same night due to cold air drainage carrying the coldest temperatures downward to lower elevations where they accumulate in stable pools. Observing where frost appears and where it doesn't provides information not just about temperature, but about microclimates and local conditions, about which locations will experience the coldest temperatures during winter proper, and which locations will remain relatively warmer due to favorable topography or exposure, about where to avoid placing shelters or camps if warmer conditions are desired for comfort, or where to seek out if cold storage of food is needed and natural refrigeration is wanted. The patterns of frost distribution across the landscape teach lessons about how cold air behaves, how it flows like water downhill and accumulates in basins, how it avoids windy, exposed ridges where mixing prevents extreme cooling, how it concentrates in certain locations, predictably enough that these cold spots can be identified and either avoided or exploited depending on needs and purposes. Understanding these patterns allows better decision-making about where to locate different activities, where to place sleeping areas that should be as warm as possible, where to situate food caches that benefit from cold temperatures, where to avoid traveling during coldest hours when temperature differences between locations might be significant enough to affect comfort and safety. After the first frost, subsequent frosts come more frequently, the intervals between them growing shorter as autumn progresses toward winter and temperatures continue their seasonal decline, the intensity of each frost increasing as night temperatures drop further below freezing with each passing week, and as cold air masses moving south from polar regions begin dominating the weather patterns more consistently. What begins as a light coating that forms only on grass and leaves and disappears by mid-morning when sun has warmed surfaces enough to melt, the ice evolves into heavier frost that persists until afternoon sunlight finally melts it, that coats everything with visible ice thick enough to crunch underfoot when walking across frozen grass, that creates slippery conditions on rocks and other smooth surfaces, then into frost thick enough that it doesn't fully melt, even during the day when sun reaches its maximum heating, that accumulates and persists from one night to the next, that signals that winter has truly arrived, rather than just visiting occasionally during cold nights that alternate with warmer conditions. This progression from first light frost to persistent ice cover typically unfolds over 4 to 6 weeks, creating a countdown that provides regular confirmation of seasonal progression, that removes any doubt about how much time remains for outdoor work and preparation before winter proper arrives and makes many tasks difficult or impossible to complete effectively. The timing of first frost relative to full winter provides reliable advance warning, because the relationship between these two events holds remarkably consistent across years, varying little from one autumn to the next, unless truly unusual weather patterns develop. When the first frost appears, winter, defined as the period when daytime temperatures remain consistently below freezing, when snow covers the ground continuously rather than melting between storms, when ice on lakes and rivers grows thick enough to walk on safely without risk of breaking through, when outdoor work becomes genuinely difficult due to cold that numbs hands and makes detailed tasks nearly impossible, typically lies 4 to 6 weeks in the future, close enough to demand attention and accelerated effort on remaining preparations, but far enough away that adequate time remains for completing work that can't be done once deep cold arrives and transforms the landscape into a frozen realm where survival depends on preparations made during warmer months. This timing relationship results from the underlying physics of seasonal change, the way Earth's orbital position determines how much solar radiation reaches different latitudes, the way heat capacity in soil and water moderates temperature changes and creates lag times between changes in solar input and changes in actual conditions experienced at the surface, the way atmospheric circulation patterns shift gradually rather than suddenly and create transitions between seasons rather than sharp boundaries. Remembering when frost usually arrives, comparing current conditions to memories of previous years, recognizing whether frost is coming early or late relative to the usual schedule, all of this constitutes a form of calendar keeping that requires no writing or counting but simply attention and memory, recognition of patterns and their repetition across years, awareness of how this autumn compares to previous autumns and what that comparison suggests about the winter to come, and whether it might arrive earlier or later than usual, or with unusual severity, or with unusual mildness. An early frost, arriving weeks before its usual time, might indicate an early winter, or simply an unusual cold snap that won't repeat immediately. But when combined with other indicators, birds leaving early, animals developing thick coats ahead of schedule, plants going dormant sooner than expected, early frost suggests that winter itself might arrive ahead of its usual schedule, that preparations should be accelerated to account for shortened time, that assuming normal timing might result in being caught unprepared when winter arrives sooner than expected. Late frost, arriving after its usual window has passed, suggests the opposite, that winter might be delayed, that a longer than usual autumn will provide extra time for preparation, though such delays should be enjoyed but not entirely trusted, since winter will eventually arrive, regardless of any temporary postponement, and preparation should be completed on normal schedule, rather than delayed in hopes that extended autumn will continue indefinitely. Specific constellations appear at sunset or dawn at particular times of year, their position relative to the horizon marking seasonal progression as reliably as solar position marks it, perhaps even more reliably in some ways, since stars can be observed during any clear night, while solar position requires daylight or the specific moments of sunrise and sunset. And people track these stellar patterns not through mathematical understanding of celestial mechanics or sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, but through simple observation of which star groups become visible at which times during the annual cycle, which constellations hang on the eastern horizon at dusk or the western horizon at dawn, which bright stars mark the meridian at particular hours during different seasons. The stars that hang low on the northern horizon during summer gradually shift their positions as autumn progresses, some of them sinking below the horizon entirely and becoming invisible from these latitudes during winter months, while others rise higher into the northern sky and become more prominent features of the night sky. These movements reflecting Earth's changing position in its orbit around the Sun, the way that different portions of the celestial sphere become visible from a given latitude at different times of year as Earth's motion through space continuously changes the viewing angle toward distant stars. Certain star patterns serve as especially useful seasonal markers because of their prominent positions or distinctive arrangements that make them easy to recognize and remember, or because of cultural significance that makes them subjects of stories and teaching that ensures everyone knows these patterns and understands their seasonal associations. When particular stars or constellations appear on the eastern horizon just after sunset, when they rise into darkness at the end of twilight, rather than being lost in solar glare that makes stars invisible near the sun, that appearance signals a specific time of year, a particular position in the seasonal cycle that repeats annually with clockwork precision. Similarly, when certain stars set in the west just before dawn, when they disappear into the brightening sky as sunrise approaches and solar light overwhelms their faint illumination. That setting marks another seasonal milestone, another reference point in the annual progression through the months that can be used to gauge seasonal timing and winter's approach. The advantage of stellar indicators lies in their independence from local weather conditions that might interfere with other seasonal signs and in their visibility across the entire night, rather than only during specific times like sunrise and sunset. Unlike solar position, which can be observed only during daylight hours or at the specific moments when the sun crosses the horizon, stellar positions can be checked any time during darkness when clouds don't obscure the sky, providing seasonal information even during periods of extended cloudiness, when gaps in the clouds reveal portions of the night sky for brief windows that allow position checking. The stars visible at a particular hour mark the date as clearly as a calendar page, and while individual observations might be prevented by cloud cover that blocks the night sky for days or weeks at a time during stormy periods, persistent attention over several nights will eventually find clear conditions that allow stellar positions to be noted and compared to memory of where those same stars appeared during previous years at this same time of season, creating confidence that understanding of seasonal timing remains accurate despite any recent inability to check due to weather conditions. Different stars provide information at different timescales because their positions change at different rates relative to the horizon as viewed from a fixed latitude on Earth's surface. Some stars or constellations make relatively rapid transits across the sky from an observer's perspective, their position changing noticeably from week to week as Earth's orbital motion changes the viewing geometry, providing fine-grained seasonal information that can distinguish between different phases of autumn or different stages in winter's approach, that can reveal not just what season has arrived, but how far into that season the current date falls. Other stars move more slowly relative to the horizon from a given latitude, their positions changing mainly across months rather than weeks, providing coarser but perhaps more reliable information about general seasonal progression rather than specific timing within a season, serving as broad markers that indicate which season currently dominates without revealing precise position within that season's span. Using multiple stellar indicators together, cross-referencing fast-changing patterns against slow-changing ones creates a robust system that provides both broad seasonal context and specific timing information, both general awareness of what part of the year has arrived and precise knowledge of how far along that season has progressed toward its eventual transition into the next season. The appearance of particular star patterns can be linked to specific intervals before winter's arrival, creating a countdown measured in celestial movements rather than days or weeks marked on calendars or counted on fingers, a system that requires only memory and observation rather than any kind of record-keeping or calculation. When certain constellations first become visible in the evening sky, rising above the eastern horizon just after sunset, when twilight fades into darkness, winter might lie 3 months ahead, distant but approaching steadily, time enough for leisurely preparation, but close enough that work should begin if it hasn't started already. When those same constellations reach particular positions in the sky, crossing the meridian at a certain hour that can be judged by the progress of the night, hanging at a specific angle above the horizon that can be measured roughly using hand widths held at arm's length, winter might be 6 weeks away, close enough to demand serious preparation and steady progress on essential tasks. When other star patterns appear that mark late autumn specifically, patterns that only become visible during the weeks immediately preceding winter proper, constellations that folklore and tradition associate specifically with cold weather and winter's approach. The countdown has reached its final stage and any remaining preparation must be completed quickly before cold and snow make outdoor work difficult or impossible to accomplish safely and effectively. The reliability of stellar indicators matches that of solar position because both derive from the same source, Earth's orbital mechanics, the way the planet moves through space in patterns that repeat with extraordinary precision, creating celestial displays that unfold on the same schedule every year, regardless of local weather or temperature or any other variable condition that might affect animal behavior or plant development or other seasonal signs. The stars don't care about whether a particular autumn is warm or cold, whether an individual year brings unusual storms or exceptional calm, whether local conditions create early or late frosts, or affect animal migrations, or alter any of the other seasonal signs that depend on weather and climate. They continue their apparent motion through the sky on exactly the same schedule they've followed for thousands of years, providing a calendar that never fails, never varies, never requires correction or adjustment, that operates with mathematical precision because it reflects the fundamental mechanics of planetary motion through space according to laws of gravity and inertia that have operated unchanged since the solar system formed billions of years ago. The wolves and foxes that hunt across the landscape, their territories often spanning many miles that they patrol regularly in search of prey, carry noticeably more weight as autumn progresses, their bodies growing rounder week by week, their movements perhaps slightly less agile than during summer months, but more powerful as increased mass provides both energy reserves for winter and additional momentum for bringing down prey. The fat accumulation that will sustain them through winter's scarcity, becoming visible even from a distance, for those who know what to look for and understand the significance of changing body condition in predators. This weight gain isn't random or variable, but follows a predictable pattern driven by both food availability that peaks during autumn when prey remains abundant and hasn't yet begun employing defensive winter survival strategies, and by physiological preparation for cold months ahead when hunting success rates will decline, and each failed hunt will cost energy without providing any return, when prey becomes scarce due to migration or hibernation or increased caution, when deep snow might reduce mobility and make hunting more difficult. Predators feed heavily during autumn when prey animals remain abundant and relatively easy to catch, when hunting success rates stay high, and each kill provides substantial nutrition that can be converted into fat reserves, and the predators convert this abundant food intake into body mass that will help them survive periods when prey becomes scarce or when cold weather makes hunting more difficult by reducing the predator's endurance and making sustained chases exhausting, when deep snow reduces mobility and access to normal hunting grounds that become difficult or impossible to traverse. Herbivores show even more dramatic fattening during autumn than predators do, their weight increasing by perhaps 20 or 30% compared to their lean summer condition as they consume the last abundant vegetation before winter dormancy shuts down plant growth and makes fresh food unavailable for months, as they build the reserves that must carry them through the long period when food consists only of dried grasses and woody browse that provide minimal nutrition compared to summer's lush vegetation. Reindeer and caribou that migrate through the region in large herds grow noticeably rounder during late summer and early autumn, their haunches and shoulders thickening with fat deposits that change their profile dramatically, their overall body condition improving dramatically compared to the lean appearance they showed during spring and early summer, when they were recovering from winter's privations and investing energy into reproduction and calf rearing rather than into building their own reserves. Horses and mammoths and other large herbivores that remain in the region year-round follow similar patterns, their bodies swelling with accumulated fat during the months when food remains abundant, their condition peaking just before winter arrives and forces them to begin drawing down those reserves to survive until spring vegetation emerges again and provides fresh food that allows them to rebuild their depleted reserves. Even smaller animals participate in this autumn fattening, the ground squirrels and marmots and other hibernators building the extreme fat reserves they'll need to survive months of torpor when they'll consume no food at all, but must maintain minimal metabolism entirely from stored energy accumulated during the brief autumn feeding period, their bodies functioning as living batteries charged during autumn's plenty to power them through winter's deprivation. These small animals might double their body weight during autumn, transforming from sleek summer forms into rotund shapes that can barely squeeze into their burrows, their bodies packed with fat that represents stored sunlight captured by plants and converted into animal tissue and energy reserves, fat that will be gradually consumed during the long winter sleep at rates carefully regulated by metabolic processes that have been refined through countless generations to ensure that reserves last exactly long enough to carry the animals through winter without exhausting supplies before spring arrives, the animals emerging in spring as lean shadows of their autumn selves, having lost perhaps half their body mass during the months of hibernation, when they burned fat slowly but continuously to maintain body temperature just above freezing and to power essential biological processes that couldn't be completely shut down even during the deepest torpor. Observing this transformation in small animals provides clear evidence that autumn has progressed significantly, that winter approaches near enough that survival preparations have become urgent for creatures whose entire winter strategy depends on accumulating sufficient reserves during the brief autumn fattening period when food remains abundant and weather still permits extensive foraging activity. For people observing wildlife condition across the landscape, watching how animals of all sizes change their appearance as autumn progresses toward winter, the fattening pattern provides several kinds of useful information that helps gauge seasonal timing and winter's approach. First, it confirms that autumn has progressed to the stage where animals instinctively begin winter preparations in earnest, where their bodies and behaviors shift from summer's leisurely patterns to autumn's urgent preparation activities, suggesting that similar preparations should be underway for human communities as well if they hope to be adequately ready when winter arrives. Second, it provides timing information because different species begin fattening at different points during autumn, creating a sequence of observations that marks seasonal progression. Predators might begin their weight gain first as prey remains abundant and easy to catch, followed by large herbivores as vegetation reaches its peak production during late summer, then smaller animals that feed intensively during the final weeks before hibernation, each group's transformation occurring at a characteristic time relative to winter's eventual arrival that allows observers to gauge how many weeks remain before serious cold arrives. Third, observing animal fattening indicates something about likely winter severity because animal physiology responds not just to current conditions, but to subtle cues that correlate with coming weather patterns, environmental signals that might provide information about whether the approaching winter will be mild or severe, short or long, harsh or relatively moderate. Animals that begin fattening unusually early or that accumulate exceptional reserves beyond what they normally build might be responding to signals that suggest a harder than normal winter lies ahead, signals that human observers don't consciously perceive, but that animal biology detects and responds to through mechanisms refined by evolution to maximize survival during variable conditions. While this predictive capacity shouldn't be trusted absolutely, animals aren't infallible weather forecasters and sometimes build excessive reserves that aren't needed or fail to build adequate reserves for winters that turn out harsher than signals suggested. Paying attention to whether animal preparation seems normal or unusual for the season provides additional information that can be factored into human preparation decisions, perhaps suggesting that extra food or fuel should be gathered if animals seem to be preparing for unusually harsh conditions. The timing relationship between animal fattening and winter's arrival typically provides 2 to 3 months of advance warning at the beginning of the fattening period, when predators and large herbivores first begin showing weight gain, with that warning window narrowing as autumn progresses and animals reach their peak condition that signals winter stands near. When predators first begin showing visible weight gain, when wolves and foxes start looking noticeably rounder than they appeared during summer months, winter might lie 10 to 12 weeks ahead, distant enough that immediate urgency isn't required, but close enough that preparation should be progressing steadily. When herbivores reach their maximum fat accumulation, when their bodies have completed the transition from the lean summer form to the rotund autumn shape that makes them look almost grotesquely fat compared to their normal proportions, winter stands perhaps 4 to 6 weeks away, close enough that human preparation should be well advanced and nearing completion. When hibernators enter their burrows to begin their winter sleep, when these animals have disappeared from the landscape entirely and their burrow entrances are sealed, winter is perhaps 2 to 3 weeks distant at most, close enough that any outdoor work must be completed quickly or abandoned until spring returns and makes such work possible again. The last edible berries ripen at specific times during late summer and early autumn, each species following its own genetically programmed schedule, but all of them completing their fruiting before winter's cold arrives and makes seed dispersal impossible. And the progression from abundant fruit scattered across the landscape to scattered remnants clinging to bushes to complete absence creates a clear timeline that marks autumn's advance toward winter with precision that rivals other seasonal indicators. The earliest berries, perhaps certain wild strawberries or service berries or other species that fruit in midsummer, ripen when winter still seems impossibly distant, when warm weather dominates completely and cold feels like a distant abstraction rather than an approaching reality, when preparations for winter haven't begun in earnest and the focus remains on enjoying summer's abundance rather than worrying about future scarcity. Later species ripen progressively later as summer transitions into autumn. The blueberries and currants and raspberries and other mid-season fruits coming in their turns, each appearing at its characteristic time that people learn to expect through years of observation, each providing both immediate food value that can be consumed fresh or preserved for winter consumption and timing information about seasonal progression that helps gauge how near winter actually stands. The final berries to ripen, the last species to produce edible fruit before winter shuts down all plant productivity and makes fresh food unavailable until spring returns, appear in early or middle autumn when other signs of winter's approach have already accumulated substantially, when birds have begun departing according to their species. Specific schedules and animals show thickening coats, and morning frost appears occasionally during especially cold nights under clear skies. These late-season berries might include certain hawthorn fruits or rose hips that persist on bushes even after leaves have fallen, or wild cranberries that thrive in cold, boggy areas and ripen only after temperatures have dropped significantly from summer's warmth. Species that have evolved to fruit late in the season, perhaps because that timing reduces competition with earlier fruiting plants for pollinators and seed dispersers, or because it provides food for animals at a time when other resources begin declining and the final fattening before winter becomes critical for survival, creating symbiotic relationships where plants provide food when it's most needed in exchange for seed dispersal services that help plants expand their ranges. The appearance of these last fruits signals clearly that the growing season is ending, that the annual cycle of plant productivity has nearly completed its course, that winter's dormancy approaches rapidly and will soon shut down all the biological processes that made summer and early autumn so productive and abundant. After the last berry species completes its fruiting, a notable absence settles across the landscape. The fruit that had been available throughout summer and early autumn simply isn't there anymore. The bushes and vines that produced such abundance now standing bare or carrying only dried remnants that birds or small animals might consume in desperation, but that provide no value for human foraging. That signal clearly that the time for fresh food gathering has ended and the time for relying on stored resources has begun. This absence creates a clear before and after distinction, a moment when the landscape transitions from productive to dormant, from offering food freely to requiring that food be obtained from stores accumulated during more abundant times, rather than from fresh gathering that is no longer productive, from supporting easy living to demanding careful resource management that will determine whether winter is survived comfortably or endured desperately. Observing when this transition occurs, comparing it to memory of previous years, noting whether it's happening earlier or later than expected based on accumulated experience across many seasons. All of this provides timing information about seasonal progression and winter's approach that confirms or questions what other signs are suggesting. The timing relationship between final fruit availability and winter's arrival typically provides about 4 to 6 weeks of advance warning, a window that shrinks as the last fruits are consumed or fall and disappear. When the last berries ripen and become available for harvest, when people can still find fresh fruit by searching productive areas where these late species grow, winter lies perhaps 6 to 8 weeks ahead, time enough to complete fruit gathering and preservation, while also working on other preparations that compete for time and attention during these busy final weeks before cold weather arrives. When those berries begin to over-ripen and fall, when they become mushy and start fermenting as sugars break down and yeasts begin converting them to alcohol, when they get consumed rapidly by birds and small animals that also recognize these fruits as the last fresh food available before winter. Winter is perhaps 4 to 5 weeks away, close enough that fruit gathering should be finishing up, and attention should shift to other preparation tasks that can't be completed once winter arrives and makes outdoor work difficult. When no fresh fruit can be found anywhere, when careful searches of known productive locations reveal nothing but dried remnants or bare stems where fruit once hung, when even the latest ripening species have finished their season and no more fresh gathering is possible until spring returns and initiates new growth. Winter stands perhaps 3 to 4 weeks distant, near enough that the focus should be entirely on completing critical preparations rather than on gathering activities that can no longer succeed regardless of effort invested. The advantage of using fruit timing as a seasonal indicator lies in its visibility and accessibility, and in the way it provides both food value and information value simultaneously. Gathering the last berries serves the immediate practical purpose of adding to food stores while also confirming what other signs are suggesting about seasonal timing and winter's approach, creating a situation where the act of monitoring the indicator also provides tangible benefit beyond mere information gathering. Different people gathering in different areas can compare notes about what fruits they're finding and what condition those fruits are in, creating a distributed observation network that provides more complete information than any single observer could gather alone, that reveals patterns across the landscape and helps identify whether seasonal progression is occurring uniformly or whether some areas are advancing faster than others due to microclimatic differences. If some areas still have fresh fruit while others show only bare stems, that variation might indicate microclimatic differences where sheltered locations or south-facing slopes retain warmth longer and extend the growing season compared to exposed areas or north-facing slopes where cold arrives earlier and shortens the productive period. Or it might suggest that the seasonal transition is occurring unevenly across the landscape in ways that require attention and interpretation to understand fully. This kind of detailed observation builds understanding not just of when winter is coming, but of how seasonal transitions actually unfold across complex terrain, where conditions vary significantly across short distances, where learning to read subtle differences in timing and progression provides advantages for planning and preparation that simple recognition of average timing cannot match. Watching fruit availability also teaches broader lessons about plant reproductive timing and seasonal cycles, about how different species have evolved different strategies for completing their life cycles, about the way that flowering time determines fruiting time, and how fruiting time relates to seed dispersal timing and eventual dormancy that shuts down all metabolic activity until spring. A plant that flowers early in spring produces ripe fruit in early or midsummer, getting its reproduction finished quickly and leaving plenty of time for the seeds to disperse and for the parent plant to prepare for winter dormancy through the accumulation of reserves in roots or other protected structures. A plant that flowers late or that has slow fruit development produces ripe fruit in late summer or autumn, cutting the timeline closer to winter's arrival, but perhaps benefiting from reduced competition for pollinators or from favorable dispersal conditions that exist late in the growing season when animals are actively building reserves and more likely to consume fruit and transport seeds to new locations. Understanding these patterns, recognizing how they fit together into a complete seasonal cycle where different species occupy different temporal niches, builds knowledge that extends beyond simply knowing when winter is coming, into understanding how the entire living world organizes itself around the annual cycle of seasons, the way that all life has adapted to work within the constraints and opportunities that the seasonal cycle creates. The prevailing winds shift from summer patterns to winter patterns during autumn, the change occurring gradually over weeks, but becoming unmistakable as the transition progresses far enough that the dominant air flows have completely changed character. The wind currents that dominated during warm months giving way to different flows that bring colder air from different directions, that carry different moisture levels and temperatures and qualities that affect how the wind feels against exposed skin and what weather patterns it brings. During summer, winds might blow primarily from the south or west in many regions, carrying warm air northward from lower latitudes or bringing maritime air inland from ocean regions where water temperatures remain relatively warm. These flows, driven by the large-scale pressure patterns that characterize warm season weather when solar heating dominates and creates thermal contrasts that drive atmospheric circulation. But as autumn progresses, and the solar energy reaching high latitudes declines due to the sun's southward movement and decreasing day length, these pressure patterns begin shifting, the atmospheric circulation reorganizing itself to reflect the changing thermal structure of the atmosphere as temperature gradients reverse and shift with the seasons. The winds that replace summer flows often come from north or east, bringing colder air southward from polar regions where the sun hangs low even during midday and provides minimal heating, or bringing continental air from inland areas where lack of maritime influence allows temperatures to drop more quickly as solar heating declines with advancing autumn, these air masses arriving with temperatures noticeably colder than the summer flows they're replacing. These winds feel different from summer winds in ways that go beyond simple temperature differences. Colder, obviously, making exposed skin uncomfortable where summer breezes felt pleasant, but also drier often, carrying less moisture because cold air can't hold as much water vapor as warm air can, according to basic physical principles. The reduced moisture creating a particular quality to the cold that feels sharp and penetrating rather than damp and enveloping, that creates different comfort levels and different challenges for staying warm. The change in wind direction and character becomes noticeable during early autumn, even when temperatures during the warmest part of the day remain relatively mild and comfortable, the wind carrying a hint of the cold to come, a preview of winter's character that provides advance warning of what lies ahead during the months when these northern and eastern flows will dominate completely and bring the sustained cold that characterizes deep winter. The timing of wind pattern changes provides useful seasonal information because the shift from summer to winter circulation occurs at a characteristic point during autumn, early enough to provide several weeks of warning before winter actually arrives in full force, but late enough that other signs of seasonal transition have already accumulated and created context for interpreting what the wind change means for winter's approach. When the first cold north winds arrive, when winds that blow from directions that rarely produced winds during summer become common and persistent rather than rare and brief, winter typically lies 6 to 8 weeks ahead, close enough to be concerning and to demand accelerated preparation efforts, but far enough away that adequate time remains for completing necessary work if progress continues steadily. When cold winds dominate completely, when barely any warm southerly or westerly flows blow anymore, and the cold northern and eastern flows have become the default condition, rather than occasional intrusions into otherwise mild patterns. Winter stands perhaps 3 to 4 weeks distant, near enough that the final preparations should be underway or already completed, near enough that the first serious winter storms could arrive at any time and mark the true beginning of deep winter, rather than just autumn's cold nights and mild days. The wind changes bring more than just colder air. They bring different weather patterns entirely, different types of clouds and precipitation, different atmospheric conditions that affect everything from how smoke behaves and whether it rises straight up or gets pushed down to ground level, to how sound travels through the air, with some conditions allowing voices to carry for great distances, while others muffle sounds and limit communication range, to how quickly exposed skin loses heat, and whether brief exposure causes only discomfort or actual danger of frostbite. Summer winds might bring afternoon thunderstorms, that arrive with impressive dark clouds and dramatic lightning and heavy rain, or gentle rains that fall steadily for hours from gray, overcast skies. Weather that arrives with drama but passes relatively quickly, leaving the air washed clean and the temperature perhaps slightly cooled, but not fundamentally changed. Conditions that might interrupt outdoor work temporarily, but don't prevent it for extended periods. Winter winds bring different precipitation patterns. Steady snows that fall for hours or days from gray, overcast skies that seem to press down on the landscape. Ice storms that coat everything with frozen layers and make surfaces treacherous and dangerous. Freezing rain that falls as liquid but freezes on contact with surfaces colder than freezing point, creating ice accumulation. Weather systems that settle in and persist rather than passing quickly and allowing conditions to return to normal. Storms that might shut down outdoor activity for days and make even simple tasks like collecting firewood difficult and exhausting. The transition between these weather regimes happens during autumn, the summer pattern gradually giving way to the winter pattern as the large-scale atmospheric circulation reorganizes itself to match the changing distribution of solar heating, and observing this transition provides clear evidence of seasonal change, of winter's approach, of the need to complete preparations before winter weather makes outdoor work difficult or impossible or dangerous. The wind also carries information through smell and through subtle qualities that experienced observers learn to recognize, even if they can't articulate exactly what they're detecting or explain in words the specific characteristics that distinguish different air masses. Cold air smells different from warm air, the reduced moisture and different chemical composition creating a particular scent or lack of scent that marks cold air distinctly for those who know what to notice, a crispness or cleanness or emptiness that announces its character immediately when stepping outside. Air that has traveled over snow and ice carries a quality that air flowing over bare ground doesn't have, a particular feel that speaks of the barren, frozen landscapes. The wind has crossed during its journey characteristics that skilled observers detect immediately and use to assess conditions and likely weather developments. Maritime air feels different from continental air in subtle ways that go beyond simple humidity measurements, the moisture content and salt particles, and other characteristics creating textures and sensations that skilled observers detect immediately and use to determine where the wind originated and what weather it might bring or what seasonal conditions it signals. Learning to read winds at this level of subtlety requires years of attention, seasons of noting which winds bring which conditions, decades of correlating wind patterns with weather outcomes and seasonal timing, building a mental database of associations and patterns that eventually allows rapid assessment based on minimal input. But once learned, this knowledge provides rapid assessment capabilities that allow someone to step outside, feel the wind for a moment, smell the air, sense its character, and know immediately something about seasonal conditions and likely near-term weather, and whether current conditions align with normal patterns for this time of year or represent unusual situations that require adjusted expectations or modified planning. An experienced observer feels the wind and knows whether it's the right wind for this time of year, whether it suggests winter is approaching on schedule or arriving early, or being delayed by unusual patterns, whether the coming days will bring clear cold or storms, or a temporary return to warmer conditions before the cold reasserts itself. This knowledge can't be fully articulated or written down in instructions that others could follow mechanically without understanding, but it accumulates naturally in anyone who pays attention consistently across many years, who makes the effort to notice patterns and remember them and compare current conditions to past experience, who learns through trial and error and observation, which wind characteristics predict which outcomes and which patterns repeat reliably versus which represent unusual anomalies that don't follow normal rules. The lake edges and river margins begin forming ice during cold nights in middle to late autumn, the first ice appearing as thin sheets that span quiet water where current doesn't prevent freezing, where the water surface sits calm enough that ice crystals can form on the surface and join together into continuous layers rather than being broken up by wave action or current that would prevent formation. This initial ice is thin and fragile, perhaps only millimeters thick, transparent enough that you can see through it to the water below, breaking easily under even slight pressure, melting quickly when morning sun strikes it with warming energy that raises the ice temperature above freezing point and returns it to liquid state, disappearing completely by midday when temperatures rise above freezing and solar heating provides enough energy to melt all the ice that formed during the cold night. But its appearance marks a significant threshold in the seasonal progression toward winter, the moment when temperatures have dropped low enough, when cold nights have become common enough that water begins transitioning from liquid to solid state, at least temporarily during the coldest hours. The formation of this first ice typically occurs at a predictable time each autumn, varying perhaps by a week or two, depending on whether that particular autumn brings warmer or colder weather than average, but generally appearing within a consistent window that people learn to expect through years of experience, through remembering when ice usually appears and comparing current timing to those memories. After the first ice appears and melts with the morning sun, subsequent cold nights bring more ice formation, each event lasting slightly longer before melting completely, persisting slightly later into the day, as temperatures remain cooler through morning hours, covering slightly more area as temperatures continue their seasonal decline, and even faster moving water begins freezing in areas where current is weakest. This progression from brief, limited ice formation to more persistent, extensive ice coverage typically unfolds over 3 to 4 weeks, creating a visible countdown toward winter proper, toward the day when ice forms and doesn't melt, even when afternoon sun strikes it, when the freeze becomes permanent rather than temporary, when water surfaces transform from liquid to solid for the duration of the winter season that might last months, depending on local climate. The thickness of ice provides additional information beyond its mere presence or absence, beyond simply noting whether ice has formed or not. Ice that forms paper-thin and melts at first light indicates that night temperatures dropped only barely below freezing, perhaps just a degree or two. Cold enough to initiate freezing in the quietest water, but not cold enough to create substantial ice thickness, suggesting that the cold remains marginal and winter still relatively distant, perhaps still several weeks away before truly harsh conditions arrive. Ice that grows thick enough to support weight without cracking, that doesn't bend visibly underfoot when stepped on carefully near shore where it tends to be thickest, indicates significantly colder temperatures that have persisted for multiple consecutive cold nights, allowing ice to accumulate thickness rather than just forming thin layers that melt each day, suggesting that winter has moved considerably closer and that serious cold will arrive soon. Ice thick enough to walk on safely across open water, thick enough that its surface appears white rather than clear because of air bubbles trapped in the ice structure and crystal formations that scatter light, indicates that winter has truly arrived, with temperatures remaining consistently below freezing for an extended period, that the liquid phase has given way completely to the solid phase that will persist until spring warmth returns and begins the slow melting process that eventually opens water surfaces again. The predictability of ice formation timing creates reliable seasonal markers because the physics of water freezing operates consistently year after year according to fundamental laws that don't change. Water freezes at the same temperature regardless of which year or which location or any other variable condition. And while local factors like current strength and water depth and exposure to wind affect exactly when and where ice forms first and how quickly it thickens, the general progression from no ice to thin, temporary ice to thick, permanent ice follows the same sequence each autumn, driven by the underlying reality of seasonal temperature decline that results from Earth's orbital position and the decreasing solar radiation reaching high latitudes as the sun continues its southward journey and day length continues shortening. When ice first appears on calm water during cold nights, winter typically lies 4 to 6 weeks ahead, close enough to be preparing seriously with focused attention on completing essential tasks, but far enough away that time remains for completing major projects if work proceeds steadily without delays. When ice persists through the day, when it no longer melts completely, even during the warmest afternoon hours, when sun reaches its maximum heating, winter stands perhaps 2 to 3 weeks distant, near enough that any remaining outdoor work must be prioritized carefully and completed quickly, with focus on absolutely essential tasks only. When ice has grown thick enough to walk on safely, when it no longer cracks or bends underfoot when weight is applied, when it produces solid footing rather than worrying flexing that suggests imminent breakthrough, winter has essentially arrived in full. The countdown has ended. The season of cold and snow and ice has begun in earnest and will persist for months until spring. Warming finally reverses the process and returns water to liquid state. Observing ice formation also provides information about microclimates and local conditions that affect how different areas experience seasonal transitions, because different water bodies freeze at different rates depending on their specific characteristics and local conditions. Deep lakes freeze more slowly than shallow ponds because greater water volume contains more heat that must be removed before freezing can occur, the thermal mass of deep water requiring many more cold nights to remove enough heat to bring the entire water column to freezing temperature compared to shallow water that cools quickly because it has less thermal mass to overcome. Fast-flowing rivers freeze more slowly than still water because current prevents ice crystals from forming and accumulating, the continuous motion breaking up any ice that tries to form and carrying it downstream where it melts in slightly warmer water. Though eventually even strong currents will freeze when temperatures drop far enough and ice forms faster than current can break it up and carry it away. Sheltered waters freeze before exposed waters because wind prevents freezing by mixing warm and cold layers and preventing the surface from cooling to freezing temperature by adding heat through friction and turbulence that must be overcome before ice can form, by breaking up ice sheets that try to form and preventing them from consolidating into continuous cover. Understanding these patterns, knowing which water bodies freeze first and which freeze last, creates a detailed timeline of freeze progression that provides more information than simply noting whether ice has appeared or not. It reveals how far the freeze has progressed across the landscape, how cold conditions have actually become, and how long the cold has persisted, whether the current freeze pattern matches normal patterns or represents unusual conditions that might indicate an early or late winter compared to typical timing. A winter that sees deep lakes freezing early might indicate unusually cold conditions that will produce a harsh winter, while a winter where only shallow ponds freeze while deeper water remains liquid might suggest a mild winter where temperatures hover near freezing but don't drop to the extreme cold that produces complete freeze across all water bodies. These distinctions matter for planning and for understanding what kind of winter is actually arriving, whether preparations need to account for extreme conditions, or whether moderate winter conditions will allow more flexibility in resource use and activity patterns. The flying insects that filled summer air with constant motion and sound that were so ubiquitous as to be almost taken for granted as permanent features of the environment, begin disappearing in late summer and early autumn, their numbers declining gradually at first in ways that might not be immediately obvious unless you're paying specific attention, then more rapidly as colder weather arrives and species reach the limits of their cold tolerance, until finally no flying insects remain visible anywhere. The air that had been full of buzzing and darting motion, and the background hum of countless small wings now empty and silent, transformed in character in ways that anyone notices even without understanding the specific changes that occurred. This disappearance happens at predictable times for different insect groups, each group following its own schedule determined by its specific physiology and cold tolerance, each with its own life cycle timing that determines when the flying adults complete their season and either die or enter dormancy or migrate away to warmer regions where they can remain active through the cold months. The earliest insects to disappear are often the species most dependent on warm conditions for maintaining their metabolism and flight capabilities. Butterflies that need high body temperatures to fly effectively and that become sluggish when temperatures drop. Certain large flies that similarly require warmth for activity. Species that begin vanishing in late summer, even while daytime temperatures remain generally mild and comfortable for humans. Their disappearance providing early warning that seasonal transitions have begun, even though obvious signs like frost or bird migration might not have appeared yet. Later, insect species persist longer into autumn, their physiology allowing them to remain active at cooler temperatures that would immobilize earlier species, their life cycles timed to take advantage of late-season resources that other insects have abandoned, their adaptations including the ability to function at temperatures that would kill or disable species adapted for warmer conditions. These late-flying insects might include certain bees and wasps that continue foraging as long as any flowers still produce nectar and pollen worth collecting, visiting the last blooming plants and gathering resources until finally no flowers remain productive and foraging becomes futile. Certain flies that can function at surprisingly low temperatures continue hunting for food or seeking egg-laying sites long after other flying insects have disappeared, their presence during cold autumn days sometimes surprising when most insects have already vanished. Certain beetles that remain active until hard freezes shut down all insect activity continue their activities into late autumn, flying on cold days that seem too harsh for insect activity, but that remain just barely warm enough for these hardy species. The progression from abundant insects of diverse species filling the air during summer to scattered individuals of a few hardy species during autumn to complete absence of any flying insects creates a clear timeline that marks autumn's advance toward winter, each stage occurring at a characteristic time relative to winter's eventual arrival. As flying insects disappear from the landscape, their absence noticed through the silence that replaces summer's constant insect sounds, and through the lack of movement that replaces summer's air filled with darting flight. Cold hardy species that thrive in cool conditions emerge to partially replace them. Insects whose life cycles are timed to take advantage of autumn's particular conditions. Species that might include certain midges and crane flies and other cold-tolerant groups that appear when summer species vanish. These autumn specialists have evolved to exploit the ecological niche that exists during the cooling period, when competition from summer species has disappeared, but conditions remain just warm enough to support insect activity for species adapted to cold conditions, when late-season resources remain available for species that can tolerate the declining temperatures. The appearance of these autumn specialists creates an overlap period when one insect community is declining rapidly while another is emerging to take advantage of changed conditions. And the timing of this transition provides seasonal information because it occurs at a predictable point during autumn, early enough to provide warning of winter's approach, but late enough that other seasonal signs have already accumulated and created context for interpretation. When cold hardy insects become the dominant flying insects visible in the landscape, when the summer species have largely disappeared, and the autumn specialists have taken over as the primary visible insect activity, winter typically lies 6 to 8 weeks ahead, time enough for preparation, but close enough to create urgency, time enough to complete major projects if work proceeds steadily, but not time to waste on non-essential activities. The complete disappearance of flying insects, the point where even the cold-hardy autumn specialists have vanished and the air contains no visible insect activity at all, regardless of time of day or temperature, marks a late stage in autumn's progression, a clear signal that winter stands very near. This final disappearance typically occurs perhaps 2 to 4 weeks before winter proper arrives, after frost has become regular and temperatures have dropped consistently below comfortable levels, when the first light snows might have already fallen at higher elevations, or during especially cold nights, when multiple other seasonal signs have already confirmed that winter approaches rapidly. The absence of insects creates a noticeable change in the daily experience of the landscape that anyone perceives even without consciously noting it. The constant background hum of insect activity that characterized summer and early autumn simply isn't there anymore. The air feels emptier and quieter in ways that go beyond mere sound level. The world has taken on a stillness that speaks of the dormancy winter will bring, a quietness that announces clearly that the living world is shutting down for the cold months ahead. Tracking insect populations requires less deliberate observation than tracking many other seasonal signs because insects are so ubiquitous and noticeable when present, so obviously absent when gone, that their presence or absence registers automatically during normal daily activities without requiring special attention or systematic monitoring. Walking across the landscape during summer means constantly encountering insects, brushing them away from face and arms when they buzz annoyingly close, hearing their constant buzzing and humming that creates the background sound of summer days, noticing them on flowers and plants wherever you look, watching them dart through the air in their endless search for food or mates or egg-laying sites. Walking across the same landscape after insect disappearance means none of that contact, none of that sound, none of that movement catching the eye. The environment fundamentally changed in ways that don't require careful observation to detect, changes so obvious that even casual attention reveals them immediately. This ease of noticing makes insect-based seasonal indicators accessible to everyone, not just to those who make deliberate efforts to track seasonal signs through systematic observation and record-keeping. And the accessibility helps ensure that the information reaches the entire community, that everyone shares awareness of seasonal progression rather than only a few skilled observers understanding where in the annual cycle the current moment falls. The combination of multiple insect-related signals, first species disappearing during late summer, late species emerging to replace them, cold-hardy specialists taking over as dominants, final disappearance of all flying insects, creates a detailed timeline that parallels and confirms other seasonal indicators, providing redundant information that increases confidence in seasonal timing assessments. When insect patterns align with bird migration timing and plant dormancy signals and animal coat changes, when all these independent indicators point toward the same conclusion about seasonal timing and winter's approach, confidence in that assessment grows strong enough to base critical decisions on. The multiple confirming signals, removing doubt, and creating certainty that winter will arrive on schedule according to natural patterns, that preparations must proceed accordingly to be complete when cold weather finally arrives and outdoor work becomes difficult or impossible. The days grow noticeably shorter throughout autumn. the change obvious to anyone who performs regular activities at consistent times and notices how the light conditions change across weeks, how tasks that could be done comfortably in evening light during summer must now be completed earlier as darkness arrives sooner each day, how morning darkness persists longer before dawn arrives and makes outdoor work possible without artificial lighting. The rate of day length change varies through the year, relatively slow near the solstices, when the sun reaches its extreme northern or southern positions and appears to pause before reversing direction, relatively fast near the equinoxes when the sun crosses the celestial equator and the rate of change reaches its maximum annual speed. Autumn contains an equinox, the moment when day and night have equal length, when the sun rises exactly east and sets exactly west, when the boundary between light and dark bisects the globe along lines of longitude, and the weeks surrounding this equinox show the most rapid day-length changes of the entire year, the sun setting noticeably earlier each evening, rising noticeably later each morning, the available daylight hours shrinking visibly from week to week in ways that anyone notices even without making deliberate measurements or paying special attention to timing. This rapid shortening creates a visceral sense of time passing, of seasons changing with increasing speed, of winter approaching faster than seems comfortable, more immediate and undeniable than many other seasonal indicators, because it affects daily routine so directly and in ways that can't be ignored or overlooked. Activities that filled summer evenings with leisurely work and social interaction, gathering food and processing it for storage, working on tools and equipment and making repairs or improvements, social interactions around fires where stories are shared and skills taught, and community bonds maintained, must compress into shorter windows as autumn progresses, must begin earlier to fit into the available light, or end sooner as darkness arrives and makes many tasks impossible without adequate visibility, or be postponed until daylight provides adequate illumination for work that requires seeing details clearly. The compression of available working hours creates pressure to use time efficiently, to complete necessary tasks during the light hours without wasting daylight on activities that could be done after dark while saving outdoor work and detailed tasks for times when vision isn't limited by darkness, to prioritize ruthlessly so that essential work gets completed before winter arrives and makes outdoor work extremely difficult. The psychological impact of lengthening darkness compounds its practical effects on available working time, creating emotional and mental responses that go beyond simple time management challenges. Long summer days feel expansive and generous, offering abundant time for all necessary activities plus leisure and rest, creating a sense that time is abundant and that there's no particular urgency about completing any specific task, because tomorrow will bring another long day with plenty of opportunity. Short autumn and winter days feel constrained and urgent, the available light never quite enough for everything that needs doing, darkness arriving before all tasks are complete, creating a feeling that time is scarce and that every hour of daylight must be used efficiently because the supply is limited and will continue declining as winter approaches and the shortest day arrives. This psychological pressure serves as its own kind of seasonal indicator, a feeling that builds gradually but becomes undeniable as autumn progresses, that communicates clearly that the time for outdoor work and extensive preparation is limited, that winter's darkness is coming and will severely constrain what can be accomplished once it arrives in full, that the window for preparation won't remain open indefinitely and will close completely once deep winter establishes itself. Measuring day length doesn't require instruments or calculations or written records, just consistent awareness of when light and darkness transition each day, when daily activities must begin and end based on available light, how much work can be completed between sunrise and sunset. Someone who rises with dawn naturally experiences later waking times as autumn progresses, the body's internal rhythms adjusting to the changing light conditions and shifting sleep patterns to match natural cycles, waking later each morning as sunrise comes later. Someone who works outdoors until visibility fails experiences earlier endings to the workday as autumn progresses, the failing light forcing an earlier transition to indoor activities or to sleep, compressed working hours requiring adjusted schedules and more efficient use of available time. These direct experiences of changing day length accumulate into clear understanding of seasonal progression without requiring any deliberate measurement or record keeping, the body and daily routine automatically tracking changes that indicate how far autumn has progressed and how near winter has approached, changes so obvious and so impactful that they can't be ignored even by those who pay no conscious attention to seasonal signs. The timing relationship between day length change and winter's arrival provides months of advance warning because the shortening begins immediately after the summer solstice. When days reach their maximum length, continues steadily through late summer and autumn and into early winter, accelerates noticeably around the autumn equinox, when the rate of change reaches its annual maximum, then gradually slows as the winter solstice approaches and the sun nears its southern extreme. The initial shortening during late summer and early autumn might seem subtle to those not paying close attention, losing perhaps 10 or 15 minutes of daylight each week. But this steady loss accumulates into substantial differences between midsummer's long days and autumn's shorter ones, between the generous light availability of warm months and the constrained darkness of cold months. By the time day length has shortened noticeably from summer's peak, by the time the difference becomes impossible to ignore, even for those paying minimal attention to daily light patterns, winter typically lies 6 to 8 weeks ahead, close enough to demand serious preparation and steady progress on essential work, while still distant enough that adequate time remains for completing necessary tasks if efforts continue consistently without major delays or distractions. The soil beneath feet and under hands changes its character as autumn progresses into winter. The transformation gradual but unmistakable for anyone who works with earth regularly. The soft moisture of summer ground that yields easily to digging and to planting, that molds comfortably around roots and tubers being harvested, giving way to increasing firmness as moisture content declines and temperatures drop, then to hardness that resists digging and makes soil work difficult, then eventually to frozen solidity that resists even the most determined digging efforts and makes many tasks that were easy during warmer months completely impossible until spring thaw eventually reverses the process. This change occurs because declining temperatures reduce soil moisture through decreased evaporation from plant leaves and through reduced plant water uptake as plants enter dormancy, because repeated freeze-thaw cycles that occur during autumn compact and harden the soil structure through the expansion and contraction that happens each time water freezes and melts, because eventually the ground freezes solid when temperatures remain consistently below freezing for extended periods, and ice replaces the liquid water that normally lubricates soil particles and allows them to move relative to each other. The progression from soft summer soil to hard, frozen winter ground creates a practical timeline that affects work and preparation significantly, that determines what tasks can still be accomplished with reasonable effort and what must be abandoned until spring returns and thaws the ground again. That provides clear evidence through direct physical contact of how far the seasonal transition has progressed and how near winter actually stands. Morning ground freezes appear during the same period when morning frost coats vegetation and exposed surfaces with temporary ice. the coldest hours before dawn, dropping temperatures low enough that moisture in the soil surface freezes solid, creating a thin, frozen layer, perhaps just millimeters or centimeters thick, that might persist through early morning hours, but melts quickly once sun warms the ground and raises surface temperatures above freezing. This shallow freeze doesn't prevent digging entirely, or root gathering or other soil-related work, though it makes such work more difficult than during summer when soil remains soft throughout the day, but it announces clearly that temperatures are dropping toward winter levels, that frost now occurs regularly during cold nights, that the seasonal transition has reached a point where cold dominates during night hours, even if afternoon temperatures remain comfortable enough that winter seems distant. As autumn progresses toward winter, the frozen layer grows thicker and persists longer with each passing week, the morning frost extending deeper into the soil as cold penetrates further below the surface, the afternoon thaw becoming less complete as temperatures fail to rise high enough to melt all the ice that formed during the night, until finally the ground remains frozen continuously, with the freeze penetrating through surface layers into deeper soil that won't thaw again until spring warmth returns and reverses the process through weeks or months of gradual thawing. The timing of ground hardening and freezing provides seasonal information, because the progression follows a predictable schedule driven by temperature patterns that repeat year after year with remarkable consistency. When the ground first shows morning hardness, when the surface layer freezes during cold nights but thaws completely during the day, when afternoon sun warms it above freezing temperature, winter typically lies 4 to 6 weeks ahead, time enough for completing tasks that require digging or earthwork while still allowing adequate margin for finishing before permanent freeze arrives and makes such work impossible. When the ground remains hard through the day, when afternoon warmth no longer fully thaws the frozen surface, when the soil stays firm underfoot even during the warmest afternoon hours, winter stands perhaps 2 to 3 weeks distant, near enough that any remaining earthwork must be prioritized immediately and completed without delay or postponed until spring, near enough that the window for soil-related tasks is closing rapidly and will shut completely very soon. When the ground has frozen solid to significant depth, when digging becomes essentially impossible regardless of effort and tools, when the earth rings hard underfoot like stone and shows no give even under heavy impacts, winter has essentially arrived in full. The freeze has extended through the active soil layer. The ground won't soften again until spring thaw eventually raises temperatures enough to reverse the freezing process and return soil to workable condition. The practical implications of ground freezing affect many aspects of daily life and winter preparation in ways that must be anticipated and planned for. Roots and tubers become impossible to dig once ground freezes hard to any significant depth, so any root vegetables intended for winter storage must be harvested before freeze penetrates to the depth where they grow, because attempting to dig them after freeze makes extraction impossible without tools and effort far beyond what the yield justifies. Storage pits and underground caches must be prepared while soil remains soft enough to excavate reasonably, since frozen ground resists even the most determined digging efforts and makes underground construction effectively impossible, or at least so difficult that alternative storage methods become more practical than attempting to dig in frozen soil. Waste disposal and sanitation practices must adjust to frozen ground conditions, since burial that was simple during summer becomes impractical when the earth won't yield to digging efforts, requiring alternative disposal methods that work with frozen conditions rather than assuming soft ground will remain available indefinitely. Even simple tasks like driving stakes for tent structures or anchoring guy lines for shelters become difficult once the ground freezes, the frozen earth refusing to accept posts or stakes that would slide easily into soft summer soil, requiring either alternative anchoring methods that don't depend on driving objects into ground, or requiring that stake driving be completed before freeze arrives and makes such work impossible. Understanding the freeze progression allows planning that accounts for these limitations naturally and in advance, completing all tasks that require soft ground before freeze arrives, preparing alternatives for activities that become impossible once soil freezes, adjusting expectations and work schedules to match the capabilities that frozen ground permits, rather than being surprised when familiar tasks suddenly become impossible due to changed ground conditions. This planning requires anticipating freeze timing based on other seasonal indicators, recognizing when ground freeze is perhaps 2 or 3 weeks away based on patterns in frost occurrence and temperature trends and other signs, then using that remaining time to complete critical soil-related tasks before the window closes, and such work becomes impossible until spring. The ground itself provides confirmation through its changing consistency, through how it feels underfoot when walking across it and how it responds when digging or working with soil, through the resistance it offers to disturbance and tools, tactile feedback that communicates clearly where in the freeze progression the current moment falls and how much time remains before frozen ground constrains severely what work can be accomplished. A person who digs regularly notices immediately when soil that used to yield easily now resists digging, when morning ground that used to be soft is now hard until afternoon sun warms it, when afternoon ground that used to thaw completely now stays partially frozen. Even during the warmest hours, these changes so obvious to anyone who works with earth regularly that they provide unmistakable evidence of seasonal progression without requiring any special observation skills or systematic monitoring efforts. The animals that move through the landscape, predators and prey, migrants and residents, large species and small, change their behavior patterns during autumn in ways that reflect their preparation for winter and their response to changing conditions that affect survival strategies and resource availability. And observing these behavior shifts provides information about seasonal timing because the changes occur at predictable points relative to winter's arrival, driven by the same environmental cues that affect migration and coat development and fattening, and all the other seasonal responses that animals show. Predators begin hunting differently as prey behavior changes in response to declining food availability and increasing vulnerability due to vegetation, dieback that reduces cover as prey becomes more cautious and more difficult to approach due to heightened wariness that comes with increased predation pressure, as the easy hunting of summer and early autumn, when prey was abundant and relatively careless, gives way to the more challenging conditions of late autumn and winter, when prey has become scarce or cautious, or both. The predators might shift their hunting territories, following prey movements as herds migrate to wintering grounds or abandon summer ranges in favor of areas that provide better winter conditions, concentrating efforts on areas where prey continues to gather around resources like water or remaining food sources. They might change their hunting times, becoming more active during hours when prey vulnerability increases due to dim light or when prey must feed despite risks because hunger outweighs caution. They might adjust their hunting strategies, employing different approaches and tactics that work better under changed conditions, where previous methods no longer succeed reliably. Prey animals become noticeably more alert and cautious as autumn progresses, their behavior reflecting increased predation pressure and reduced escape cover as vegetation dies back and makes hiding more difficult, as the landscape transitions from summer's lush growth that provided abundant concealment to autumn's sparse vegetation that offers little protection from predators' eyes. Deer and elk and other large ungulates that seemed relatively relaxed during summer when food was abundant and vegetation-provided cover become skittish and nervous during autumn, bolting at smaller disturbances that they would have ignored during summer, maintaining greater flight distances from potential threats, spending more time with heads-up scanning for danger, rather than feeding peacefully with confidence that they'll detect threats early enough to escape. Smaller prey species, rabbits and ground squirrels and other mammals that predators target opportunistically, show similar increased caution, their movements more furtive as they dash from cover to feeding areas and back. Their feeding more rushed as they grab food and retreat to safety rather than feeding leisurely in the open. Their use of cover more careful as they stick to areas that offer escape routes and protective concealment. The easy visibility and relaxed behavior of summer replaced by the nervous wariness of autumn when predation risk rises and survival margins narrow. Feeding patterns shift across many species as food availability changes and as animals prioritize different resources based on their nutritional needs for winter preparation and based on what remains available as seasons change and different food sources appear or disappear. Herbivores might concentrate more heavily on high-fat seeds and nuts rather than on vegetation that provided summer nutrition, building the energy reserves they'll need for winter survival through targeted consumption of calorie-dense foods that pack maximum energy into minimum volume. Omnivores might shift from primarily plant-based summer diets toward more meat consumption as insects and small animals become available while plant foods decline in abundance or quality, adjusting their foraging strategies to match changed resource distribution. Predators might target different prey species as some migrate away or enter hibernation, while others become more accessible due to changed habitat conditions, concentrating efforts on species that remain available rather than wasting energy pursuing prey that has become scarce or inaccessible. These feeding shifts create observable patterns in animal movement and distribution that reveal how animals are responding to seasonal changes, concentrations forming around remaining food sources where multiple individuals or groups gather to exploit resources that have become rare elsewhere, absences developing in areas that no longer provide adequate nutrition and that animals have abandoned in favor of more productive locations. Changes in daily routine as animals adjust their activity schedules to match food availability patterns that differ from summer schedules. Vocalization patterns change as well, the soundscape of the landscape shifting from summer's patterns to autumn's different acoustic environment in ways that anyone notices even without understanding the specific changes causing altered sound patterns. Bird songs that dominated summer mornings diminish or disappear entirely as migrants depart according to their species, specific schedules, and as remaining residents reduce their singing activity because territorial defense becomes less important during autumn than resource acquisition. Wolves and other predators might increase their howling or calling as they establish winter territories or coordinate pack activities for the hunting season ahead when cooperation becomes more important for successfully bringing down large prey that has become scarce and wary. Elk and deer vocalization increases dramatically during autumn rut, the mating season that occurs at this time of year, the bugling of elk bulls, and the grunting of deer bucks creating sounds that weren't present during summer months when breeding wasn't occurring, sounds that carry for considerable distances, and that dominate the soundscape in areas where these species concentrate during breeding season. Even small animals change their calling patterns in ways that careful observers notice, ground squirrels and marmots vocalizing differently as they prepare for hibernation, prairie dogs and other social species adjusting their communication patterns as they transition from summer to winter social structures, changes subtle perhaps, but noticeable to those who pay attention to the acoustic environment and remember how it sounded during previous seasons. The timing of these behavior changes provides seasonal information, because they occur at characteristic points during autumn, early changes appearing when winter still lies distant, late changes signaling that winter approaches near. When prey animals first begin showing increased wariness, when their relaxed summer behavior gives way to autumn caution that makes them harder to approach and observe, winter typically lies 6 to 8 weeks ahead, time enough for preparation, but close enough to create concern about completing necessary work. When feeding patterns have shifted completely, when animals concentrate entirely on winter preparation resources rather than general foraging that characterized summer feeding, when their behavior reflects urgent preparation rather than leisurely resource exploitation, winter stands perhaps 4 to 5 weeks distant, near enough that the urgency of preparation becomes obvious across species. When vocalizations have changed to their winter patterns, when the acoustic environment sounds fundamentally different from summer's soundscape, when elk bugling has peaked and declined and other seasonal sounds have appeared or disappeared according to their schedules, winter is perhaps 2 to 3 weeks away, close enough that any remaining preparation must be completed quickly before conditions make outdoor work difficult or dangerous. Reading animal behavior at this level requires attention and experience that accumulates across seasons and years, requires watching consistently and remembering how behaviors unfolded in previous years, requires correlating behavior patterns with seasonal outcomes and weather conditions so that current observations can be interpreted correctly in context of accumulated knowledge. An experienced observer watches animals and knows immediately what their behavior signals, whether it matches normal patterns for this time of year, whether it suggests early or late winter, based on whether preparations seem advanced or delayed relative to usual timing, whether unusual behavior indicates unusual conditions ahead that might require adjusted preparation strategies. This knowledge can't be gained through brief observation or through reading descriptions, but accumulates naturally across years of consistent attention, building into expertise that provides rapid assessment and confident prediction based on subtle cues that inexperienced observers might miss entirely or might notice without understanding their significance. The convergence of all these signs, birds departing on their species-specific schedules, sun moving southward along the horizon with mathematical precision, animals growing winter coats in response to photoperiod cues, plants releasing seeds and entering dormancy according to their evolved timing, frost appearing at its usual time and progressing toward permanent freeze, stars marking seasonal positions with perfect reliability, wildlife fattening as evolution programmed them to do, berries finishing their season on schedule, winds shifting from summer patterns to winter flows, water beginning to ice at its characteristic time, insects disappearing in predictable sequence, days shortening according to orbital mechanics, ground hardening and freezing as temperatures decline, animal behavior changing across species, creates a robust prediction system that provides reliable advance warning of winter's approach, measured not in days but in weeks and months. A system that works not through any single indicator that might sometimes fail or mislead due to unusual local conditions, but through multiple independent signals that confirm and reinforce each other, that together create overwhelming evidence that removes doubt and builds confidence about seasonal timing and what lies ahead. Using 10 or 15 different signs simultaneously means that even if one or two indicators show unusual patterns in a particular year, perhaps due to local weather anomalies or unusual conditions that affect some species or processes but not others, the majority of indicators still provide accurate information that allows correct prediction of winter's arrival timing. A warm autumn might delay frost appearance beyond its usual window, creating false impressions that winter might be delayed if frost is the only sign being monitored, but birds still depart on schedule because they respond to day length rather than temperature, their migration timing unaffected by whether current weather feels warm or cold. An early cold snap might create temporary ice formation that melts when normal temperatures return, potentially suggesting early winter if ice formation is the only sign being watched. But animal coat development follows its usual photoperiod-driven timing regardless of brief temperature fluctuations, continuing on schedule and revealing that the cold snap was an anomaly rather than the true beginning of winter. The redundancy built into the multiple indicator system creates reliability that no single sign could match alone, the various signs cross-checking each other and highlighting any unusual patterns that require extra attention or adjusted interpretation to understand correctly. The sophistication of reading nature's multiple calendars lies not just in knowing individual signs in isolation, but in understanding how they relate to each other in an integrated system, how their timing normally aligns in patterns that repeat year after year, what it means when signs agree and confirm each other versus what it suggests when signs disagree or show contradictory patterns, how to weigh different indicators based on their reliability and their relevance to local conditions and their sensitivity to various factors. Someone skilled in seasonal prediction doesn't just watch for signs appearing in isolation, but watches for patterns across all the signs simultaneously, for the way they converge toward a unified message about seasonal timing, for the confirmation that comes when bird behavior and plant dormancy and celestial position and animal preparation all point toward the same conclusion about when winter will arrive. This synthesis of multiple information streams into unified understanding represents genuine expertise, knowledge built across years of attention and observation and memory, refined through testing predictions against actual outcomes and comparing what the signs suggested would happen to what actually occurred, adjusting interpretation based on experience until the predictions become reliably accurate and can be trusted for making critical decisions about preparation and resource allocation. The system rarely failed to predict winter's arrival accurately because it was based not on superstition or guesswork or magical thinking, but on genuine observation of natural patterns driven by real physical and biological processes. Patterns that repeated with remarkable consistency because the underlying causes, Earth's orbital mechanics that determine solar radiation patterns, the physiology of plants and animals responding to environmental cues, the thermodynamics of atmospheric processes that create weather patterns, operated with mathematical precision year after year according to unchanging natural laws. The birds departed when day length changes triggered their migratory urges because evolution had refined their timing across thousands of generations through relentless natural selection, eliminating birds that migrated too early and wasted energy or too late and got caught by winter, preserving birds whose timing aligned properly with seasonal progression. The sun moved southward on its inevitable path because orbital mechanics permitted no deviation, because gravity and inertia determined Earth's motion through space with absolute predictability. The plants went dormant when their physiology responded to photoperiod and temperature in ways that millions of years of evolution had optimized for surviving seasonal cycles. The reliability of these processes created reliability in the signs they produced, and people who learned to read those signs gained the same reliability in their seasonal predictions, the same advance warning that the natural world itself used to prepare for winter's arrival. This knowledge meant survival through adequate preparation time, through knowing weeks or months in advance that winter approached, and using that time wisely to gather food while it remained available, to improve shelter while weather still permitted outdoor construction work, to collect fuel while trees could be cut and transported without the difficulties that deep snow creates, to complete all the tasks that would mean the difference between surviving winter comfortably with adequate resources and struggling desperately through cold and scarcity with insufficient food and inadequate shelter and not enough fuel to maintain warmth through the long, dark months. Without this advance warning, without the ability to read natural signs and predict seasonal timing accurately based on multiple confirming indicators, winter might arrive before preparations were complete, catching communities unprepared and creating hardship that adequate warning could have prevented. But with the knowledge that came from watching birds and tracking the sun and observing animals and noting plants and feeling winds and monitoring ice and reading behavior, with the understanding that built from paying attention consistently across years and decades, building mental databases of patterns and relationships and timing associations, winter never arrived as a surprise, never caught anyone unprepared, because the natural world announced its approach clearly and consistently through dozens of signs that accumulated across weeks and months. Signs that anyone could learn to read through patient observation and attention, that removed all mystery from seasonal prediction and replaced guesswork with genuine knowledge based on reliable natural patterns that repeated with the same certainty that the sun rose each morning and set each evening, that the seasons followed their eternal cycle, that winter would come again as it always had and always would, announced by the same signs that had marked its approach for as long as anyone could remember and for as long as the seasons themselves had existed on this turning earth.